Welcome to Ideas That Inspire, where uplifting stories spark hope, inspire change, and remind us that we all have the power to make a difference. Hello, my friend, and welcome back to the Ideas That Inspire podcast. I'm your host, Emily, and today we're diving into a topic that doesn't always come up in everyday conversations: emotions. If you have ever been curious about where your emotions come from, how they are connected to your physical health, and the impact that they can have on your body, this episode is for you. I'm joined by Kim Knight, also known as the Kiwi Health Detective. Kim is a root cause and lifestyle medicine practitioner with over 20 years of clinical experience, helping people heal from chronic pain and fatigue. After overcoming multiple chronic illnesses herself, she's passionate about helping others tap into the body's natural ability to heal and trust themselves when it comes to their own health. I first met Kim at some local networking events and was fascinated by her story, especially her journey with understanding emotions. Launching this podcast certainly brought up a lot of feelings for me, and as creative entrepreneurs and business owners, uncomfortable emotions tend to be part of the journey. In this conversation, we explore how emotions can affect the body, how to get more comfortable feeling the uncomfortable, and simple tools to help you recognize, allow, and process your emotions, rather than just pushing them aside and hoping they'll disappear. I hope this episode helps you understand your emotions a little better and feel more supported on your own journey. Here's my fascinating conversation with Kim. Welcome to the show, Kim. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk to me today. To begin, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, your business, and what it is that you do.
I call myself the Kiwi Health Detective, and I work as a root cause and lifestyle medicine practitioner. And my goal is to help people to heal illness with as little need as possible to use any external interventions such as medication or supplements. And the reason that I'm very passionate about doing this is because I absolutely understand the natural healing ability of the body, that it's built to heal itself, either mentally, emotionally, physically, energetically. And the problem is that most people have not been given the user manual on how to do that. It's not something we're taught as we grow up. And we also live in a society in the Western world, New Zealand, Australia, UK, USA, where for the past 150 years we've been immersed in a medical paradigm which has just been getting stronger and stronger, that our body gets sick and there's nothing we can do about it except use medication or surgery. What I've learned through my own journey of healing multiple chronic illnesses without having to use medical intervention is that our body is built as a self-healing mechanism, but we have to learn A, what is causing the body to go out of its natural homeostasis, and B, what we need to do to bring it back to its natural state of homeostasis. And that requires that the person themselves takes an active role in their healing, and effectively they become their own doctor. So really what I'm doing is teaching people how to become their own doctor, which of course goes against the mainstream medical narrative. But usually people come to me once they've tried many, many other things and not had a result, and they're getting rather desperate, and then somehow they find my website. So I hope that gives a little bit of an introduction. There's many other things I could say about what I do, but that's just a start.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And it's so great to know that people like you are out there creating these different spaces for people to come to when they're ready to go down that path, and to help the community just to get to know you a little better. Can you share your cultural background and how where you grew up shaped who you are today?
Well, I grew up in the UK in what is called over there a middle-class family, because there are quite distinct class differences, especially in the UK. Just had an average upbringing, if you like. Went to school, did lots of sports, Went to university, did lots of sports, didn't do much study, and then was on course, so to speak, to live an average life of going to work and getting married, having 2.2 kids. And then I had quite a life-changing experience in my late 20s, which interestingly enough was the Saturn return time, if people are familiar with that, which comes around every 28 years, where what can often happen, I didn't know this at the time, I learnt this later, is that stuff in your psyche that has not been dealt with or resolved will come up for resolution. So often people can go through a crisis period at that time, which is what happened for me. And I was diagnosed with depression, and I'd never heard of the word depression. Somebody had to explain what it even meant. I didn't know I was depressed, and started counseling, and then that opened a Pandora's box of, oh, I have these things called feelings, and I've been storing a lot of not so happy feelings inside of me. And then things actually got worse, which is quite common. Things can get worse before they get better.
Mm.
And I ended up in hospital having what is commonly termed a nervous breakdown. And as I later pieced together, it was actually a complete transformation of consciousness. It was literally like a building being demolished so that a new building could be built in its place. But I had no idea that that was happening at the time. Although interestingly enough, I have worked with a few clients who've gone through a similar experience. And it wasn't until that it was explained to them that this was happening that they felt some relief, because they just couldn't understand why everything seemed to be breaking down in their mind. So I came through that experience, and then shortly after that I moved to New Zealand, and then had another interesting experience of going through being in an abusive relationship, which had actually started in the UK, but I didn't understand what was going on. And it took some time to recognize that I was in an abusive relationship. And this is very common, by the way, for people who are in abusive relationships, is to not actually recognize what is happening and just to tolerate it and think it's normal. And interestingly enough, the reason for that is because if we grew up in an environment where that sort of behavior was going on, it was normal for us, and then so we don't recognize that it's not normal as we get older. So that was another major learning experience. I did a lot of traveling as well. I've always loved traveling, and I used to speak 3 languages fluently. And so I had a lot of work where I was able to use those languages, and then came over to New Zealand when I was 30.
It doesn't sound like an average life to me. It sounds like you've been through a lot and different experiences, and you've certainly been on a deeply personal healing journey, which I assume has led you to the work that you do today. Can you share more about this journey with us and why you decided to turn your experience into the business that you have now?
Yes, it's interesting. I didn't actually consciously choose to work as a therapist, but it chose me. And there are a few sayings I think that fly around, like, life is what happens when you're making other plans, or if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans, that sort of thing. So my dream had been to work in the film industry, and I was on track for doing that. After I moved to New Zealand and I extricated myself from this very unhealthy relationship, which has turned out to be an incredible gift, because I've helped so many other people over the years to do the same, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't gone through it myself. So after I extricated myself from that relationship and was getting on with my life, I decided I'm really going to start pursuing my dreams. And my dream for many years had been to work in film production. And in fact, when I was working in London, I used to go to work every day, get on the tube, walk to the office where I was working, and I would walk past a film production office. And I just wanted to go in there and ask, how do I get started in the film industry? But I felt too shy to do that, so I never did. And in 1993, which was 3 years after I'd arrived in New Zealand, that this was when I really started to deep dive into personal development work. I didn't realize I was really doing that at the time. I was just following my nose, as I usually do. And I found myself on a 3-day personal development course, which was very intense. It was one of those workshops where they keep you awake long hours so that they break you down and you cry and you bash pillows and you might scream a little, and it sounds awful maybe to somebody who hasn't done that sort of a type of workshop, but it really was a breakthrough experience for me.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, one of their workshops was called Breakthrough. And the first workshop was called Turning Point, and it was a turning point. And then the second one was called something about self-empowerment, which it also was. And so I started to do this personal development and learn more about myself. And I committed as a result of one of the workshops that I did that I was going to pursue my dream of working in film production. And my commitment was to do a 1-week course. So I went off, started this 1-week course, which was just an introductory course, introducing people to what are the different roles that one can work in film production, and just little exercises of using the camera and all sorts of things. And by 11 o'clock on the Monday morning, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. And it was like, well, how do I pay the $10,000 fee? And literally a week later, I got an email from a lawyer that I'd been working with in the UK over a car accident that I'd had several years before, and it had just been dragging on and dragging on. And they sent me this email and said, this is the final offer you're being offered, and it's $10,000.
Wow.
And I was like, right, I'll take that.
Perfect timing.
Oh, absolute perfect timing. And so a few months later, I embarked on this full-time 1-year film production training program in Auckland and absolutely loved it. So after I finished film school, I got a job in a video production company and was really enjoying it. But there was one thing that was really irking me, and that was what they were paying me. I was earning an absolute pittance of a salary. It was $24,000 a year. Even back then was quite a low amount. And I remember we had a fantastic interview, and I thought, wow, I really like these guys. They're from the UK. I'm really gelling with them. I can see that we're going to work well together. And he left the salary issue right until the end of the interview. And he said, well, I've just got to let you know that we can only offer you a really low salary. And when he said the salary, my stomach turned. And that was my gut brain, which I learned many years later, telling me, no, you're worth more than that. And it literally did a somersault in my gut. And that was my gut brain saying, no, don't take the job at that rate. It's not the right thing to do. But because I was so keen to work, and because I didn't have high self-esteem and didn't value myself enough, and because it was actually quite hard to find work, I said yes. And the reason for sharing this is that this started to build up a lot of frustration and resentment inside of me that I wasn't really noticing as I was working. But as I discovered later, because that was 1995, 96 by this time, and it wasn't until 4 years later that I actually came to understand the power of emotions to create physical symptoms. I didn't realize what was happening at the time, but I was working very, very hard, as I always do. I always give 110%. And I was building up all this frustration over giving so much and not really receiving what I was worth. And over the next few months, I started to get more and more tired. And as I learned later, when we suppress our emotions, which are energy, we have to use energy to suppress that emotional energy, but we don't realize we're doing that. But we do. We're using our life force to unconsciously suppress our feelings if we don't want to feel them. And so I was using my energy to suppress my energy and getting more and more tired. And I couldn't understand why I was getting more and more tired. And I would try and get a good night's sleep, and I went on holiday, and I'd take weekends off. I was doing everything that I knew to do to replenish my energy, but it wasn't working. And I was getting more and more tired. And then I came down with a really, really bad virus, flu, which I've also learned since why that happens. It's like a last straw effect of the body trying to get our attention that something isn't right and we need to make some changes. The body just sort of takes us out. And so I got very, very sick on top of this tiredness. And I was so sick, very unusually, a month later I was still off work. And then the office rang me and said, if you don't come back to work, we're going to have to employ somebody else. And I didn't want to lose my job. So I came back to work and I was just even more exhausted. And after a couple of weeks, I just couldn't go on. And I walked into work one day and I quit. And I didn't want to quit, but I just couldn't put one foot in front of the other. And then I went to the doctor and was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, or CFS. And at that time, well, still now actually, the medical system say, well, we don't know what causes it and we don't have any solutions, just go home and rest. And so that was what I was told. And of course, since then, I've done a huge amount of exploration and understanding of what causes chronic fatigue and how to heal from it. And so I now know that that wasn't true, but they just said that because they don't know. That doesn't mean there aren't solutions out there. It's just that they don't understand the solutions. So that then took me on a very, very long journey to heal, which I had no idea it was going to take that long. For the first 3 months, I did absolutely nothing. I was at home. The highlight of my day was watching The Love Boat. I would drag myself out of bed, come downstairs, watch The Love Boat, just sort of mope around the house, go back to bed and rinse and repeat the next day. Then The Love Boat finished and I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with my life now? And I suddenly had this very, very strong feeling inside of me. I cannot spend the rest of my life doing this. This isn't a life. And I made a very, very strong commitment to myself in that moment that I was going to find the answers and I was going to get well. I didn't know how, but I just knew that I was going to find a way. But I didn't know what I was going to do. But that commitment suddenly opened up opportunities that started coming to me in the form of books that would cross my path or therapists or workshops. And over the next 4 years, I did a lot of learning of natural healing and actually doing some trainings, not to be a practitioner, but to learn for myself. And I was inching my way forward very, very slowly to getting better, but not really getting better. And sometimes it was 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I got to about 2000, which was 4 years later, and I still wasn't well. This had been 4 or 5 years now of this fatigue. And I was lying in bed one day in one of my, what I call my fatigue crashes, where you're so tired you can't do anything. You're just in bed. And I said to myself, what would I do if I only had a few months to live? Because after 4 or 5 years of this going on, I was starting to believe or to think, maybe I'm never going to get well, which is very common for people to think when they've been ill for a long time. So I asked myself this question, what would I do if I only had a few months to live? And the answer came immediately. It was, I would do this dream trip around the world that I've been dreaming of. And I'd been dreaming of going to certain places around the world, like Egypt and certain places in America and South America. And I literally had a 2-drawer filing cabinet full of brochures of all the places I wanted to go. And I'd been collecting these brochures, never ever really thinking that I would go, but just collecting the brochures because back then we used to still have a lot of brochures. It wasn't so digital. And so this thought came to my mind, I would do this trip. So then I asked myself the question, well, how can you do this trip if you can't even get out of bed right now? I don't know how, but I just thought to myself, well, I'm going to do it. And I made this decision that I was going to go and do this trip, because if I didn't do it now, maybe I'd never be able to do it. I put my house on the market, which I did regret later, and I sold it within 2 weeks, and I took that as a sign that it was the right thing to do. And I set off on this trip around the world. I somehow managed to plan it. And every so often I would have crashes and I would have to stop somewhere and be bedbound for a while. And I was still looking for answers. I can see looking back now that it wasn't just a trip around the world. I was looking for answers. And right at the end of the trip, I had my turning point in understanding how emotions cause physical symptoms. Because that sounds quite a weird thing to say, emotions cause physical symptoms, but there is a direct correlation. And that happened when I went to a therapist who then became my teacher, who gave me a session, and he said, the good news is that you have lots of energy, and the bad news is that you're holding all that energy inside, and specifically you're holding all your emotional energy inside, and that's why you're so exhausted. In that moment, I had the most hugest emotional release that I've ever had, and bawled my eyes out for an hour, and I couldn't stop. But at the end of it, I was able to walk out of that clinic, and I'd actually had to take a taxi to get there because I was too tired to get the train, and I was just a different person. And then I started to train with him.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, and you've shared some great wisdom and golden nuggets in there, and been through so much and been so brave, and I'd love to know what happened next.
Yeah, thank you. So what happened was, and I will share this story because it was quite amazing really, was I had a 12-month ticket around the world, and because it was a special deal, it had quite restricted terms. And usually I think with a 12-month ticket, you can't extend. It was about at the 11th month out of the 12 months that I met this man who became my teacher. And as I was leaving his clinic, I saw a flyer about some workshops that he was teaching that were going to go over the next 3 months. And I really wanted to do them. I just knew that I wanted to study this stuff. It was just so life-changing to understand, oh my goodness, I found the reason why I'm so sick, and now I've got solutions that I can learn and use. And so I rang my travel agent in New Zealand when I got back to my hotel room and said, can I change my ticket? And he said, absolutely not. Just no way they're going to allow you to change a ticket. And for some reason, for the next week, I kept on getting this ticket out and looking at it, just looking at the ticket over and over again. It was very bizarre. And after about a week, I suddenly noticed that when I had rerouted, which I had been allowed to do 6 months before, they had put the wrong expiration date on my reissued ticket, and I had an extra 4 months. That I thought was quite extraordinary. You know, it's like, is that fate or what? I don't know. But when I saw that, I then rang him back and I said, you won't believe this. He said, I've just noticed that my ticket has 3 months extra on it. Will this work? And back then it was all paper tickets that you hand over when you go to the counter at the airport. And he said, well, I don't know. You can just try it. So I decided to risk it. And I went and did the training course. And then I went to the airport, to Los Angeles airport, to get back on the plane. And my ticket was accepted. And I remember sitting in the lounge just wishing to get on the plane and the plane take off so that somebody wasn't going to tap me on the shoulder and say, excuse me, we found that your ticket isn't valid. But I got back to New Zealand, and that really started me on a whole new journey of healing myself. So I'd had this turning point and I'd had a huge shift, but I still had work to do to heal. That the fatigue wasn't completely gone, and I had a lot of emotional healing, if you like, to do. And so I spent the next 6 years doing that. So altogether, this was 10 years to really turn things around and heal myself. And just want to say for anybody listening that it doesn't have to take that long. I really feel like I took the long road so that I could help shortcut it for other people. And generally when I work with other people, it's 3 to 6 months, not 10 years. But that was my journey. And one of the reasons I believe it was so long was that I really, really had to explore what is it that creates illness and what is it that one has to do to heal. Because I kept making a step forward or 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I used to keep asking myself, why aren't I well? Why aren't I well? Which is what a lot of people do. And then I learned to change that to, what is it I need to learn? What is it I need to change? Because that was more productive. And there was always something new that I had to learn to do or to change that hadn't been done, that needed to be done in order to heal myself. So it was a very, very long journey. And that brought me to about 2006 when I could say, yeah, I'm about 95% better. At that point, I then started to ask myself, okay, so what do I want to do now? Do I go back into film production? Do I do my previous type of work as a PA or travel? or do I do something else? I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. It was very, very difficult to get into the film production still. I did try. I actually tried a couple of years before that to get back into film production, but it just wasn't bringing in enough income. And so I had to give it away, which was very, very difficult. And I'd done lots and lots of trainings at this point purely to heal myself. It was just for my own information, for my own healing, absolutely no thought of being a therapist. So by this stage, I'd trained in energy healing, in Chin At Sang abdominal massage, which is a form of Qigong. I trained in Qigong. I trained in lots of emotional healing therapies and flower essences. Funnily enough, I actually was sorting through my certificates this weekend, and there's probably about 100 certificates that I have overall of all the different trainings that I've done, some of them short, some of them very long. So by the time I was at 2006, I personally tried and tested over 250 therapies, and I had been certified to a professional level in, at that point, probably about 15 different modalities. One of them was specifically tailored to helping people with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, post-viral fatigue syndrome, ME, and these chronic pain and fatigue conditions. And of course, I had a special interest in that because that's what I'd been through myself. And because I'd trained to a professional level, I'd been put on a website of one of these therapies, and I started getting calls from people. And I would say, no, I'm not a therapist. I did the training. And then there was this one lady who kept ringing me and saying, please, will you help me? And so one day I decided to have a session. I thought, well, why not? And that was how I started. And I'd also done a lot of the abdominal massage training, and people started coming to me for that as well. But I don't do body therapies at the moment anymore. And I've just put one foot in front of the other, really. And now, over the last 10 years, have really developed my own protocol, which I call Total Life Healing, because one of the things that I learned from this first Qigong teacher of mine was this lovely phrase, which I have on my website because it's so important for people to understand, is you don't heal illness, you heal a person. And you don't heal a health condition, you heal a whole person's life. That was what I had to do on this very, very long journey. I had to learn what is it that causes illness and what is it that resolves illness. One thing that I found very fascinating, and nobody ever taught me this in any of my trainings, I just saw it when I was working with clients, the same theme would come up over and over again, was that the foundation for illness is set up in the first 7 years of life, because that's when our belief systems are set in place, which lead to our behaviors and our behavioral patterns and our emotional response patterns and trauma being stored in the body. It all starts in the first 7 years of life. So whatever starts going awry later on in life, even if you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 80s, there's going to be some link tracking back to what were the first 7 years of your life like.
So interesting. I'd like to go back to what you said right at the end of your trip, and you were working with the man that you ended up training under, and he said that you've got a lot of energy, but you're using all that energy to keep your emotions in. And I'd love to explore emotions a bit more. I know your work focuses on self-healing and empowerment, and emotions are a big part of our everyday life. If we want to heal and grow, that often means navigating challenges and stepping outside of our comfort zones. I know from my personal experience, for example, starting this podcast, that growth can be both exciting and terrifying at the same time. How can we learn to embrace our emotions, or this good stress that we feel, in a healthy way that fuels our growth and our health, rather than overwhelming us and, as you've been speaking to, potentially leading to long-term negative health effects?
Yeah, well, the thing that I really learned with emotions early on, again from my teacher, whose name is Gilles Marin, by the way, he's in the USA, and he said the most important thing that emotions need is to be validated. In other words, they need to be acknowledged. That is the very first step. And actually, there's even a step before that, which is to be aware that we're having an emotion. Because it's very, very easy for a lot of people to actually not even know what they're feeling. When I was growing up, I didn't know that I was feeling a certain way about a certain thing. I can see looking back now, it would play out, for example, in me being grumpy. But the reason I was grumpy was because I was unhappy or frustrated or whatever I was feeling. So emotions can play out in other ways. We can, for example, get sullen. That's a sign that somebody is feeling frustrated or hurt, but they don't realize maybe that they're feeling those feelings and they don't know how to deal with those feelings. They don't know how to express those feelings, so they don't know how to deal with them for themselves, but they also don't know how to interact with somebody else about their feelings. And this is a major issue in our Western society. We are very, very emotionally illiterate. And this is why we have to learn emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is something that has been up and coming, so to speak, for the last 10, 20 years. But from my observation of when a lot of people, especially in the corporate world, talk about emotions, they're talking about it in a very basic way. They're not really talking about how to really deal with one's emotions, feel emotions, dissolve emotions, process emotions, clear emotions, and eventually become emotionally masterful. There are very, very few people focusing on doing that from my observation. The thing with emotions is that, first of all, we have to be aware of what we're feeling and we need to be able to label what we're feeling. And I've found that there are just about 10 core emotions that we need to pay attention to and be able to label. And I heard many years ago that there are apparently 43,000 emotions that have been identified, which is insane. But really, we only need to focus on 10 core emotions. Those emotions are things like fear, sadness, grief, hurt, disappointment, frustration, anger, loneliness, boredom, lack of joy. These are the core feelings that we need to be able to identify within us. In other words, when we're feeling those feelings. Once we are able to identify what we're feeling and label the feeling, then we need to acknowledge the truth of how we're feeling, which is the validation. Once we've acknowledged, we need to accept, which is slightly different from acknowledging. Acknowledging is just saying, hey, yes, I see you. And accepting is actually really fully accepting, okay, I accept the fact that I'm feeling like this. And then we need to have some sort of tool to self-digest or self-dissolve that emotional energy out of our body. Because the interesting thing about emotions is that they're generated from inside the body. Yes, there is a correlation with the brain, but the actual emotional feelings are generated as energy from inside the trunk of the body. In other words, between the neck and the pelvis. And different emotions are generated from different parts of the body. So, for example, if you feel angry, you're likely to feel a tensioning under your right rib, which is where the liver is. And this is where Chinese medicine is very, very useful. And I just did a podcast actually that I released yesterday about the lung energy, because the lungs hold sadness and grief and the liver holds anger and frustration and the gallbladder holds resentment. But when we feel angry, for example, or get angry, our liver area constricts. And over time, if we keep getting angry and angry and angry, but we're not dealing with it, we're not releasing it, we're not clearing it, that energy starts to change the biology of the area where the emotions are being generated from, which is the liver and the gallbladder. And this is why people end up with chi blockages and then illness in their liver and their gallbladder. And it's interesting because a lot of people may have their gallbladder taken out, but there are many other solutions to dealing with gallstones. Firstly, do a good liver detox, but a really proper one. That's a whole other story, a whole other tangent we could go down, which again I learned from this teacher, is that you must prepare your liver and your kidneys properly to do a good liver detox by eating certain foods, not eating certain foods for a month before you actually do the gallbladder part of the cleanse. But if we don't deal with these emotions, then they just get stored in the organs and start to put those organs out of balance. And that's when we can start getting physical problems in those organs. So different emotions gravitate and get stored in different organs. So hurt is stored in the heart, and sadness and grief are stored in the lungs. Fear affects the kidneys, and worry, which actually isn't an emotion, it's a mental habit, and it's an unconscious habit to protect ourselves. Worry is fear, and we're afraid of something, but it's all in our mind. It's not real. We're mentally rehearsing what we don't want to happen. That's what worry is. But if we worry and we overthink, which then turns into anxiety, that affects the spleen and the stomach.
Are you looking for a way to support the podcast and the planet? Ascent's Ocean Foam Hand and Body Wash has been bringing me so much joy lately. It's not just the fresh East Coast citrusing scent. It's the feeling of supporting a purpose-driven Kiwi business, doing things differently. Patrick, the founder of Ascent, has created something really special, a fully circular refill system that's simple and sustainable. You get a beautiful glass bottle with a durable steel pump designed to last, and when it's time to refill, you can send your empties back for free. It's honestly a no-brainer. And as a bonus, the Ideas That Inspire community gets 10% off the wash set, gift set, and duo set with the code IDEAS10OFF. That's IDEAS, the number 10, OFF, at ascentrefills.nz, or by using the link in the show notes. If you're ready to ditch single-use plastic and support innovation that's good for people and the planet, start your Buy Once Refill Forever journey with Ascent today. Feeling stuck with an idea, goal, or dream? You don't have to figure it out alone. In a clarity call, I'll help you find fresh perspectives, get unstuck, and move forward with confidence. Book your session now at ideasthatinspire.com. Yes, you didn't mention anxiety in that list of 10. I'd love for you to share a bit more about where anxiety fits, because it's such a common thing that people talk about these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an interesting thing that I learned along the way in the trainings that I did, is that anxiety is not an emotion, it's a symptom. And depression is not an emotion, it's a symptom. So I'd explain how one comes to that conclusion. So what happens is, from the moment we're born, we're an emotional, energetic being, and we're always responding to what is happening in our environment. If we feel good and happy, we're going to experience emotions like happiness, peace, joy, excitement, all the good feeling emotions. If we're not feeling happy, if we don't feel safe, if we feel threatened in some way, if we feel like we just can't feel at ease in our environment, which happens for a lot of people as they're growing up, then the body will go into the stress response, and simultaneously it will generate what we call negative emotions, which are just uncomfortable feeling emotions, which are designed to be uncomfortable so that we notice them and do something about them and interpret the message and the meaning within the emotional response. So, for example, say you're in an environment where you're being shouted at and criticized and maybe even being hit, then the body will go into the stress response, which is the fight, flight, survival response. It's the sympathetic nervous system response, or SNS, which I like to call SOS. And it will simultaneously generate emotions like hurt or sadness or anger or frustration. And that is because we have two intelligences in our body, the head intelligence and the body intelligence. And the head is the thinking, analyzing, rationalizing part of our intelligence. But the body intelligence, which is actually a combination of the heart and the gut brains, because we have 3 brains in our body, the head, the heart, and the gut. And that's been proven scientifically. Could go off on another tangent there, talking about how many neurons we have in each brain. But I've got a video on YouTube that people can check out about the 3 brains. But what happens is the body intelligence doesn't speak words, it doesn't speak English, it doesn't think in thoughts. It sends body sensations, which initially is just maybe stress or a gut feeling or a sense of uneasiness, just like when I had that interview and my gut brain said, no, you should not take this job at that rate. You need to negotiate the rate, or you need to walk away and find another job. That was my gut brain, my gut intelligence speaking to me, but I didn't know back then that's what it was doing. So if our body is sending us messages via emotions, these core emotions like the fear, the anger, the sadness, the hurt, the disappointment, the boredom, the loneliness, if we're not taking notice of those feelings, which often in the first 7 years of our life, we don't have the intellectual capacity to do that. And if we don't have people around us who can teach us and recognize what we're feeling and encourage us to share our feelings and all that sort of thing, we just store it all inside. So if you imagine that you have a pot inside you, and every time an emotion is generated, literally from the moment you're born, every time an emotion is generated and it's not dissipated, energy isn't dissipated, it will be put into that pot. And over time, that pot will fill up. And as it starts getting close to the top of the pot, and we still don't know that those feelings are there, it's absolutely amazing how many feelings we can store inside of us and have absolutely no idea that they're there. It's really quite extraordinary. And I discovered that in my learning journey, my healing journey, because in order to heal or dissipate my symptoms, I had to identify the emotions which were underneath the symptoms. So I had to train myself to really identify what I was feeling in order to get rid of the symptoms. And by the way, I'm not saying that emotions are the only reason for symptoms. It's just that they're a big reason, that they can be a core reason, and this needs to be looked at. So anyway, we have this pot which is being filled up with emotional energy. And remember, emotions are just a form of energy. As the pot fills up, unconsciously, and it's very important to note this is unconscious, we say to ourselves, oh dear, my pot's about to overflow and that will be really messy and I'll make a real mess of the stove. What am I going to do? Okay, I know what I'll do. I'll put a lid on it. I'll put the lid on the pot. So we put a lid on the pot to depress the emotions, and that is when we start to experience depression. We're depressing the emotions, and that will be experienced as depression. Then, because emotional energy just wants to move, it's not static, it still wants to get out and be freed, it will try and come out from under the lid like steam coming out from under the lid, and that is anxiety. So anxiety is one too many emotions in the pot of emotions. So that is one explanation for anxiety. There's more that I could say about that, but each person is very, very different, and this is why one has to actually really know the life history of each individual person and see their emotional patterning responses and what their beliefs are to really say, okay, well, why is your anxiety there? Because there will be multiple reasons why somebody has anxiety. But it's really a build-up of emotions. It's also very tied to this worry thinking habit, which is mentally rehearsing what we don't want to happen, and being stuck in fear, which is a real habit, and so we have to stop that habit because it can be stopped because it's a habit, and explore more why it's there in the first place.
Thank you for that analogy. That's a great visual to think about when we're going through feeling anxiety or depression, thinking about how that is an accumulation of things. And
just to add that, and this came as a result of doing the abdominal massage. So the point of the abdominal massage, which is in Chinese is called Qin Et Sang, which means internal organs qi massage, is to make a connection with the different internal organs which are storing the emotions and to clear the emotional toxicity from the organs through the massage and through helping the person get in touch with what is inside of them that they have not been in touch with. Because one of the biggest problems for people is that we're very disconnected from ourselves. We're disconnected from below the neck, really. We live in our heads. And one of the reasons that people come to be so disconnected is because they don't want to be in touch with their feelings because they're afraid of feeling their feelings. So through the massage training that I did, one comes to really understand this connection between emotions and the physical body. For example, if you have a lot of frustration and anger that you're not wanting to feel, and this is very, very common, by the way, and often when people say, oh, I never get angry, it doesn't mean that they don't have anger. It just means that they don't allow themselves to get angry and they don't even know that they're holding anger. But what happens is when we have a lot of frustration and anger stored inside of us, which is in the liver area and the gallbladder, which is just underneath the diaphragm, underneath the right-hand side of our rib cage, unconsciously, in order to not feel those feelings, we will bring our diaphragm upwards. We won't breathe properly. We won't breathe fully and expand the diaphragm downwards when we're breathing, and we'll become shallow breathers. And the diaphragm will get very tight, and that area underneath the ribs will get very sticky and tight. And on the left-hand side, underneath the left ribs, we have the stomach and the spleen. And if we worry a lot and overthink, that affects the stomach spleen area, and it also starts to get very sticky and tight under that part of the body, and the diaphragm gets very stuck as well. And when we have this restriction in this area where we're not breathing deeply, we're not doing belly breathing, which is an important thing to do, is to learn how to breathe deeply into the belly. Everything just gets stuck, and that actually creates, just from a physiological level, it creates anxiety, or it contributes to the anxiety because we're not breathing properly.
That's so interesting. So to help us have a bit of perspective in how that fits into something happening in our everyday life, for example, starting this podcast and doing interviews, I spent some time worrying about that, having some fear, having these different emotions coming up. And I'd love for you to share some practical techniques that you recommend for me and for someone doing something that's bringing up some emotions, and how we can move through these and avoid these impacts on the body that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is not an easy thing to answer in a really simple way, but I'll do my best to give some practical tips. And the reason that I say that it's not that easy is that you really have to understand a full person's history,
right,
and what has led them to have those fears, in order to know what is the best approach to clearing them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
One really useful thing that I learned in one of the trainings that I did is that humans could be said to have 4 core fears. So there's the fear of rejection, the fear of losing someone or something, the fear of feeling feelings, and the fear of feeling vulnerable. So the fear of feeling vulnerable and the fear of feeling feelings is really how we're feeling internally. And the fear of rejection or losing something or someone, it's still internal feeling, but it's to do and connected with something else or someone else. And so what happens is, because we don't want to feel those feelings, we don't want to have those experiences of rejection, of losing someone or something. Imagine if you're in a relationship and things aren't going well, but you're still afraid of losing that person. Or fear of rejection is maybe, fear of being criticized or judged or rejected. We have this fear of feeling our feelings because they're not pleasant to feel, when they're feelings like hurt or sadness or fear. And we have this fear of feeling vulnerable. What happens is we unconsciously create beliefs and behaviors which protect us from experiencing those 4 fears. And everything is unconsciously geared around avoiding feeling rejected, losing someone, avoiding feeling our feelings, and feeling vulnerable. So first of all, we have to recognize that. It's useful to actually know, okay, well, this is what's going on. And we need to start becoming emotionally literate, which means we need to start noticing when we're feeling a certain feeling, and rather than ignoring it or pushing it under the carpet, pushing it away, all these strategies that we have to avoid feeling our feelings so that we won't experience these 4 core fears. But we have to become more emotionally literate and literally be able to label what we're feeling at the drop of a hat and notice it immediately we start feeling it. And initially, when we start training ourselves to feel our feelings or label our feelings, it can take some time to actually become conscious that we're feeling a feeling. But the more we do this, the shorter the gap gets between an emotion being generated inside the body and noticing that we're having that emotion. And by the way, I do use the word emotion and feeling interchangeably. Some people don't, but I tend to. So we have to start to train ourselves to become emotionally literate. And then we have to start to ask ourselves, and there are certain processes that one can take oneself through. It's not something I can share here, but one can start to ask, really delve and explore, why am I having this emotional response? So probably easiest if I give an example. Many years ago when I was flatting in Auckland, I had a flatmate and we were getting on very, very well. It worked quite well because I was working from home. I had a home clinic and he was out during the day working, and it just worked really well. But because I was home a lot more than he was, I was doing a lot more things around the house. And in particular, I was stacking the wood during winter and bringing the wood in when we needed wood for the fire. And I noticed over a period of a week or two, I suddenly started to feel resentful that I was doing all the stacking of the wood and that he wasn't doing anything. And so I recognized this, and it wasn't going away, and I knew, okay, there's something here going on, you need to look at it. One really useful question that one can ask when one's being triggered by a situation is, what does this remind me of? And so I asked myself, what is this feeling of resentment and frustration over this wood stacking situation? What does it remind me of? Immediately, the thought popped in my head, oh my goodness, this is just what it felt like when I was a kid. And remember, I said that everything gets set up as a kid in the first 7 years of life. This was exactly how I felt as a kid when I was growing up in my family, and my brother, who was autistic, was only given one job, which was to empty the waste paper baskets. And I felt like Cinderella. I'm not kidding you. I was literally polishing the silver, and I was just cleaning the house from top to bottom. And I hadn't realized that back then, as a child, that I was very, very frustrated and angry that there was such an unevenness in the chores that we were given, because I didn't understand that as a kid. But the frustration was building up nevertheless, and probably some hurt as well, because usually anger is an emotion that is a protective emotion that covers over other emotions. So if we ever get angry, we have to ask ourselves, what am I really feeling underneath that? So as I asked myself, what does this remind me of? I had this flash memory of the situation when I was younger, and I realized that I hadn't cleared those feelings that had been stored inside of me for 40 years or whatever, just around that particular situation. And so I gave myself permission to feel those feelings, and really what came up was sadness. I was feeling sad and hurt, and so I just allowed myself to feel those feelings. So one of the things we have to learn to do is, rather than turning away from our feelings, is turn towards them and embrace them. And one of the easiest things we can do as a really entry-level exercise, a self-processing technique, which is very simple but also quite profound and effective, is once we've labeled the emotion, which we must do first, we just say to ourselves, and it's best to close the eyes when we're doing this, we need to go internal. We just say to ourselves, this feeling is welcome. I welcome this feeling. And if we've labeled the feeling, for example, sadness, we go, this sadness is welcome. I acknowledge and welcome this sadness. And we put our attention on the feeling wherever it is in our body. Because, as I said before, feelings need to be validated. We need to give them our attention without judgment. So we can close our eyes, we can put our attention on the feeling, which will be somewhere in the body. And remember, I said before that anger is likely to be around the liver area, the sadness is likely to be in the lungs, the hurt is likely to be in the heart. But it may not be there. Some people can feel things in their arms and their legs and all over the place. But generally speaking, it will be in the trunk of the body. So we put our attention on the physiological sensation or counterpart of that emotional energy, because there is a physiological counterpart of that emotional feeling, and they are actually one and the same thing. But to help us find it, we put our attention on that part of the body and we just observe it, and we welcome and accept the truth of how we're feeling. Now, that is a very general statement, I need to say, because different emotions need different approaches. And one of my programs, MCT, Manage, Clear and Transform Emotions, goes through the different emotions and the different approaches they need. And I don't have time, and it's not the place to go into that now, because it needs a lot more explanation. But for example, one thing I will mention is that we need to be very careful with anger. how we manage anger, because in Chinese medicine, as I mentioned before, the different emotions relate to different organs and different organ systems, and anger relates to the liver as well as the gallbladder, and each of these organ systems relates to a different, what's called elemental force, and a different season. So the liver is wood and the season of spring. So the liver is the wood energy. And the thing with wood, which is like trees and shrubs and nature and plants, is that it grows. I mean, if you plant a tree, it's just going to grow and grow and grow and grow. Any plant in the ground, it's just going to grow and grow and grow until you trim it. And so with anger, we want to be very careful. Sometimes it's the right place to just explode, just sort of scream or shout or whatever. That's usually when things have got to the point of the lid is just about to blow off the saucepan, or the volcano is about to explode. But apart from that, we need to be very careful not to get really, really angry, because that anger will just grow and grow. And now the interesting thing is, if you think of these 5 elemental forces, is that the lungs is the metal element and the liver is the wood element. And metal chops wood. So one of the ways that we can deal with anger is to breathe deeply and change our breathing pattern, and also to move the body. A note on sadness, for example, is that yes, it's good to cry and let out sadness, but not to get really stuck in it and get too deep into it, because if we have really, really long crying periods, so to speak, it really, really depletes the body of energy, which is why we feel tired after we've cried. Yes, of course, it's okay to shed a few tears, but we have to learn the boundaries of how much do we go into a feeling and how much not. Now, another technique that I highly recommend, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of videos on YouTube where one can learn how to do it oneself, is emotional freedom technique, or EFT, or tapping. Same thing. And that is very, very effective for as soon as you have a feeling, and you don't have to go into the thoughts of why do I have this feeling and into the story and into the past. None of that. You just have to simply take yourself through a tapping process to clear the feelings. But the key secret with tapping is that you don't immediately tap and try and make things better. You need to validate what you're feeling. So this comes back to the same thing. The emotions want to be validated in order to be cleared and dispersed. And so we just tap. We just literally talk ourselves through and say what we're feeling, and the emotion will dissipate. So that's a few thoughts that hopefully are helpful.
Thank you. So fascinating, and so many good things to think about and to take on board and start having awareness and practicing in our lives.
I have to say, it is a huge topic. It really is. Once you start exploring emotions, it's a very, very deep and broad topic. People often, we're all wanting this magic pill, this easy thing of like, I just do this and then everything is sorted. Well, it's not that simple. We have to really explore and come to understand ourselves more. Why do we operate the way we operate? What are our belief systems? Like you mentioned before about the fears about starting a podcast, which is pretty common for any new venture, is for some fear to come up. And so we can always ask ourselves, okay, well, are any of those 4 core fears in play? Fear of rejection, or people might not like what I'm doing. Maybe I'll get criticized. Maybe I'll get judged. Maybe it's scary to be seen. All sorts of fears that can be in play, which are connected to our unconscious beliefs. And one thing that is really interesting to explore is what is called our glass ceiling. So in particular for women, we can have what is called a glass ceiling, where we're afraid to stand up and be seen, or to go beyond our previous limitations, so to speak. But the reason that we have this glass ceiling is so complex because it's due to whatever limiting beliefs we may have, which have formed as a result of our own upbringing. But it's also tied in with our culture. In different cultures, it's okay to do certain things, and in other cultures, it's not. And we've been growing up in a culture which has been very patriarchal rather than matriarchal. And so women culturally for many decades now have been held down. And obviously we've been standing up more, but it's still in the collective psyche, so to speak. Yeah, so many things that one could look at.
Mm. Some of this information could be new to a lot of people. If anyone in the community is interested in learning more about what you do as the Kiwi Health Detective, where can they connect with you and learn more about working with you and doing this work with emotions? And can you share a bit about what that looks like?
Sure. I mustn't forget to say that my websites are a little bit of a mess because I do them all myself and all of them are in drastic need of updating, so I do apologize in advance. I'm trying to separate my websites out and make them more streamlined for each of the areas that I work in. So my Art of Health website, which is artofhealth.co.nz, that is really for people if they're needing help with physical issues. Now, of course, we know that it's going to track back down to some emotional stress issues probably, but people are coming in the door because they've got some physical issues, and it could be a long-term health condition, which is when we would need to do the proper root cause analysis, or it could just be some niggly shoulder pain where I do what I call a Kiwi Health Detective session, because what's so fascinating about so many pains that seemingly come on out of nowhere for no reason is that they're very, very often connected with something that was going on that stressed us out or caused some emotions that we haven't recognized. To give a short example, I was working with a colleague of mine who's a doctor some years ago. We were on a training program together and we were doing a session swap. And he had this pain under his right rib, where, as we know now, is the liver area. And he'd had this pain for a year and a half or so, and he just couldn't get rid of it. He tried lots of different things. And so we did a Kiwi Health Detective session, and what came up was that it was very connected with some frustration that he was feeling with his ex-wife that he hadn't recognized and he hadn't let go of. And as soon as he recognized it in the session, the pain just disappeared. So I have found more often than not, and I wouldn't say always because that would be wrong, but certainly for myself and certainly for the people that I've tended to work with, is that there's usually some stress, emotional, something or other going on. That is why that pain is there. So that's the physical illness side of things. And then I have my Emotional Alchemy Academy website, which all it is really is on-demand self-help programs for people wanting to learn about emotions and learning how to become more emotionally masterful. And I may be putting some sessions on there as well, but they're not on there at the moment, one-to-one coaching sessions. So the third website is my Qigong website, which is daohealthqigong.com. And I've been practicing Qigong for 25 years now, and in that time I've trained in 3 different styles of Qigong. And the main Qigong system that I'm following now is called Ren Shui Wangong Qigong. And its main focus is on developing wisdom, on cultivating one's consciousness and clearing out all the old unhealthy patterns of consciousness and unhealthy ways of thinking, unhealthy ways of emotionally responding, which lead to unhealthy lifestyle habits and behaviors. So really cultivating ourselves on a very profound level, because the way they look at things is that the reason that the world is in such a dire strait, so to speak, at the moment is because we're not doing this inner work. We're focusing on the external and developing the external. So we have all these wonderful scientific advancements, but we're not advancing our consciousness, and we need to work on the inside in order to improve our external reality. And that means personally and collectively. So that website is dedicated to my Qigong courses. Those are the 3 main websites for anything to do with health and personal development.
Quite a good range of different things that people can come and work with you with and dive in and explore for different areas of their life. To wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave the community with? Anything that you think is important that we haven't covered?
Well, probably what I just mentioned there about the Qigong is that what I found personally is that in order to improve my life, I need to do the inner work. And one of the reasons we don't do the inner work or don't want to do it, it comes back to feelings, interestingly enough, and this fear of feeling feelings. And so we have to learn that even though it's not pleasant to feel emotions like sadness or fear or hurt, as we become more proficient, we can actually move through these feelings very, very quickly. So rather than staying stuck in the depression or the anxiety or the whatever the feeling is for months or years, we can clear it very, very quickly the more emotionally adept we become. Really, the key to our mental health and our emotional well-being and our physical health, so much of it tracks back to being able to self-manage and self-clear our feelings. And also, one thing that I didn't mention is we have to do our own work inside in terms of dissolving feelings. We also need to learn how to express our feelings with other people, and that's a big part of the work that I do. In fact, I would say there's very, very few clients I've worked with who haven't had to learn how to do that. And that is literally learning how to say, for example, I feel frustrated about XYZ and I need XYZ. People are just so afraid of expressing their feelings because of this huge fear collectively of feeling and facing feelings. So we really need to do the inner work if we want to feel happier. And the interesting thing about life is that the way it will bring our attention to the need to do this work is that if we have problems turning up in our life, and that could be any sort of problem, it could be a problem at work, with people, with our health, with our finances. If problems are turning up in our life, it's usually a sign that we need to do some inner work. So as they say, our outer world is a reflection of our inner world. And the more we do this inner work, the happier we become. In the Ren Shui Qigong system, they say there are 5 treasures of life that we're really after. So we may say that we want the perfect relationship, the perfect job, the money in the bank, the perfect house, the car, whatever it is. But actually what we're really wanting is these 5 treasures of life, which are health, happiness, harmony, the ability to contribute, and the ability to grow and develop realization and wisdom. On a personal level, this is the route to true happiness and fulfillment. But on a collective level, if we really want to see the change that everybody says they want to see in the world, we all need to do this inner work, because the collective is just the totality of all the individuals. And through doing this inner change, that is how we will change the outer world and make the world a better place. And that may sound very trite, but it's actually probably very true. And it's what spiritual teachers have been trying to tell us for decades and centuries. But unfortunately, man has been going down what is called the materialistic route, and really going more and more into materialism and disconnecting ourselves from our spiritual nature and our true self. And our journey is to find our way back to our true self and to make the world a better place by doing that.
Oh, that's beautiful, and rounds out perfectly, ties in with everything this podcast is about, uplifting others and making the world a better place. So thank you for that, and thank you again for being here and chatting to me today. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and I've definitely learned a lot, and there's a lot to think about and process and look forward to in the future. So thank you.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for doing a great job with your podcast.
I hope you found my conversation with Kim as fascinating as I did. What really stood out to me is where our emotions are stored in the body, and how simple yet powerful it can be to just pause, acknowledge, and actually feel them in the moment. It's such a good reminder that emotional intelligence isn't just about improving our mental well-being. It's a huge piece of looking after our physical health too. If this episode sparked interest for you and you'd like to dive deeper into Kim's work or connect with her, you'll find all the links in the show notes. And next time on the podcast, I'm going solo. It's been 3 months since launching Ideas That Inspire, and I'm looking forward to sharing what this experience has been like so far. I'll be reflecting on what I've learned from producing a podcast, where I'm at now, and what's next for me in this journey. I hope you'll join me for a little behind-the-scenes catch-up. Thank you for being part of the Ideas That Inspire community. If today's episode sparked joy or inspiration, please share it with a friend, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. Because the more people that hear these stories, the more change we can create together. You can join the conversation on Instagram at Ideas That Inspire, where we connect, share, and support each other in living mindfully and making a real impact. You can also find us on YouTube, or visit ideasthatinspire.com to apply to share your story on the podcast, or book a clarity call to take the next step towards your own inspiring idea, goal, or dream. Let's light up the world together, one idea at a time.